Spider Who, Chapter 8. There was something to be said about how a person reacted in the face of a life-threatening event for the very first time. Some people puffed out their chests whenever they discussed the possibility of being in such a situation, declaring that they would be firm and bold until they came out of the other end victorious, while others didn't even bother to stick around long enough as they gave into their flight instincts before the danger had a chance to pose as a viable threat. But as Flint Marco marched straight towards her with such murderous intent on his face, all that Mary Jane could do was just stand there, frozen in fear.
You think you're some hero?
Marco asked as he took yet another menacing step, accompanied by a withering sneer.
You're nothing but a weak little girl who doesn't know when to run when she had the chance.
With one last step, he was right in front of her now. One hand harshly grabbed at her arm and pulled her so that she was flush against his sandy chest.
And that makes you stupid.
The exact moment he raised the arm that had been transformed into an axe, openly displaying the intent to cut her down right where she stood, was the moment where Mary Jane finally found herself. Immediately she began to struggle against his impenetrable hold as she screamed, her free fist pounding away at his sandy chest. But to no avail.
No!
An abrupt, scratchy voice spoke up from behind Flint Marco's hulking form. With a shift of her irises, she spotted him. And the sheer difference in size between Spider-Man and Flint Marco was daunting. On instinct, Flint whipped his head back to try and locate the boy, only to be met with an ironclad fist straight to the jaw. Marco reared back from the force, his grip on Mary Jane slackening just enough so that she was able to slip out of his hold.
It makes her brave,
Spider-Man continued to say as he took a deliberate step sideways, putting himself between Mary Jane and the monstrous beast that towered before them.
something that someone with sand for brains couldn't quite understand.
Flint turned to face him fully in a rage. His arms lashed out from his body to try and catch Spider-Man, but his movements were too slow.
Maybe that should be your supervillain name.
Spider-Man quipped as he evaded yet another sledgehammer swing. Mary Jane took several paces back, getting out of the way of their fight.
Or better yet, the fearsome Dust Bunny. I gotta say, that name will sure send a shiver down any housekeeper's spine.
When will you learn to just shut up?
Flint yelled as Spider-Man flipped out of the way of yet another one of his attacks. The sprinkling of rain turned into a light drizzle then, but it was something that was hardly within her notice compared to the spectacle before her very eyes.
Wait.
A sudden gasp escaped Spider-Man as he maneuvered around a sandy fist.
That voice. I think I'm starting to remember you.
Flint snarled before he swung his arms at Spider-Man, once again just a beat too slow.
Yeah.
Spider-Man said musingly before his entire form became animated.
Yeah, now I remember. You're on the streets all the time.
Spider-Man flipped back out of the way from an extended sandy fist that had been launched at him. He landed yards away, perched perfectly on top of a red fire hydrant.
But what are you doing all the way out here, man? I usually see you working the corner on 7th Avenue in Brooklyn.
Marco screamed in rage and launched himself forward in a full-out sprint towards Spider-Man. In an instant, Spider-Man backflipped off from his perch and did a roundhouse kick at the fire hydrant. The red metal launched high in the air from the powerful kick, where it would land dozens of yards away. Water immediately gushed out from the previously covered spout, and Flint Marco was now too close to avoid the watery eruption of it. Flint Marco staggered back out from the blast, but he was too late. His solid form looked to be melting into sopping mud that couldn't hold itself together anymore, unable to keep up the compression of the grainy particles in order to maintain his tall stature. It was as though he were trying to perform a reenactment scene of the Wicked Witch of the West's famous demise. Then, the clouds broke open, and a steady rainfall fell from the sky. aiding in doubling the efforts of the spurting fire hydrant. The blood-curdling scream was abruptly cut off, leaving behind a ringing echo in our ears that accompanying the pattering sound of the rain. Flint Marco was now more liquid than sand, as the mud fell in splats to the cement street, where the combined water of the fire hydrant and the rain caught him in its flow to the storm drain, leading to the murky darkness of the sewers below. Mary Jane was lost in a daze as she stared at the storm drain, now devoid of any mud or sand at all. Did he just die? A movement out of the corner of her eye captured her attention. Spider-Man had flipped to the other side of where the fire hydrant once stood, and was now shooting a large gob of webbing at the gaping hole, suppressing the gushing water to the point where not even a drop was leaking through. When he was finished, Spider-Man stood back and surveyed his work with his hands on his hips. He must have found it satisfactory, because in the very next moment, he crouched down low before propelling himself up in a leap high in the air. The movement was so effortless and graceful that it looked as though he belonged up there in the sky, where he was currently within his element. A large gasp escaped her as she watched him skillfully shoot out a web from his wrist with a muted whip before it attached itself to the nearest building. It was then, as she observed his fluid movements amongst the tall buildings, where Mary Jane finally managed to get a grasp on her bearings. Was he leaving? Panic, so sharp, pierced at her chest. He was leaving without saying anything to her at all? Didn't he recognize her? Didn't he want to at least see if she was unharmed? The coursing desire to talk to him, to touch him, overwhelmed her. She needed to stop him. "Spider-Man!" Mary Jane cried out. Her hands were high up in the air, waving about as she tried desperately to capture his attention. And she knew that she had been successful when Spider-Man paused briefly at the sound of his name. She nearly grinned as hope spread from her stomach, along with the bouncing butterflies. But that was all dashed as soon as she saw the minute shake of his head to himself, before he let loose yet another web, propelling himself up higher in the air and zipping over the ledge of the nearest building, disappearing into the dusk of the rainy night. "Wait," Mary Jane whispered brokenly to the open air. Her arms, that had been waving about so erratically, slowly lowered back down to her sides as the rain now slowed to a drizzle. So, he didn't remember her after all. Even after he promised that he wouldn't forget her? There was a distinct taste of bitterness on her tongue as she tried not to let the crushing disappointment overcome her. Mary Jane wasn't typically one to cry, but she felt the urge to now. Why had she let it get to this point? She had built him up so much in her head that she had been expecting to not only see him again, but to actually have some sort of connection, a shared bond. She was such a fool. A brisk breeze blew through the streets then, spattering rain onto her body alongside of it, which served to send a shiver down Mary Jane's spine. She was soaked. Her arms came up to automatically wrap around herself as she continued her original trek down the street. Alone and defeated. Acute exhaustion to the highest degree suddenly washed over her, making her brain feel a bit foggy. The day had suddenly caught up to her and was whirling around in her mind. Over and over again, the memories played in her thoughts with the tauntingly bleak hue that outlined the edges. Her father slapping her. Flint Marco pinning down Spider-Man in a chokehold. Flint Marco almost killing her. She shivered again, but this time, it had nothing to do with the cold. The streets were completely deserted now. The attack, along with the rain, made the New Yorkers scarce for once. It was eerie, especially when she could hear the sound of the approaching police sirens out in the distance. She kept walking, her head down and her body shivering to combat against the cold and the traumatizing memories. Her feet managed to carry her a couple of blocks when Mary Jane heard it. A faint thwip sound broke through the night air behind her. Mary Jane stopped, nearly tripping over her own 2 feet as she gasped, smiling as the sound registered with her. Surreptitiously, she peeked up toward the rooftops out of the corner of her eye. She couldn't see him, but she knew that he was there. She could sense it. The real question now was, what was she going to do about it? Skidding to a halt, her feet stopped abruptly as she pretended to look around. An innocently perplexed pucker to her brows that accompanied a concerned downturn of her lips. Damn! I think I'm lost. She made sure that her voice carried, though even she could tell that she said it a little too loudly. But she didn't care all that much. What she was about to do was her element, the theatrics and the arts, and she was going to have so much fun with it. She waited a moment as she looked around a bit more, discreetly trying to catch any flashes of red and blue over the rooftops through the darkness of the night and the rain as they worked together to impede her vision. Oh well, Mary Jane said in an overly dramatic sigh of disappointment and a nonchalant shrug. I guess I'm going to have to walk down this dark alley now. Alone. Mary Jane looked down the alleyway next to her in a very pointed manner, which looked far from what she would call inviting. It was a long alleyway that extended to the next street over, which wasn't the best part of the neighborhood. Yep, looks safe enough. She waited a brief moment for any sort of interruption. When there was none, she shrugged again and started walking down the dark path. She went slowly, her heart pumping with adrenaline and excitement for the situation. Would he take the bait? Or was she just being stupid? All that Mary Jane knew was that there was only one way for her to find out. By calling his wordless bluff. She was in the middle of the alleyway now. She could hear the thudding of her own heart in her ears, the scrape of her feet against the concrete as she took step after step.
Are you deliberately trying to get into trouble?
A sudden voice spoke up from behind her, his tone stressed. A sly, secret grin appeared on Mary Jane's face before she turned on her heel to face him. And there he was, hanging upside down on a line of webbing in that ridiculous homemade costume of his. And yet, at the sight of him, her heart started to pound double time in her chest. And to think, he had this effect on her, and she has never even seen his face. He could look like anything underneath that mask. He could be horribly disfigured or have terrible acne from wearing the mask all the time. But somehow, she found that it didn't bother her in the slightest. Because it was his character that drew her to him. Like a moth to the flame. Or she was more accurately a moth that was completely ensnared in his web. Only when I know that you're nearby to help me get out of it, Mary Jane finally replied. She had meant for her voice to come out teasing, practically oozing with confidence, but her tone had instead sounded soft, sincere. God, what was wrong with her? For some unknown reason, being around Spider-Man caused her to almost swoon with infatuation. Mary Jane never swooned. Boys usually fell over themselves for her, not the other way around. Spider-Man tilted his head curiously at her. Those bulky goggles of his shifted with slight movement. She briefly wondered what the purpose of those goggles were for. Mary Jane held her breath as he stared her down for the longest of moments, looking at her with sightless eyes that somehow made it feel as though he were looking straight into her soul. Mary Jane stared back at him head-on, never once breaking the connection. Somehow, she just felt as though looking away first in that moment would make her seem weak, which was far from what she wanted to be perceived as when she was being scrutinized by Spider-Man. Until finally, Spider-Man relaxed his hold on the webbing that held him upside down. He did a little flip and landed nimbly on his feet in a low crouch before he straightened to face her. Mary Jane let out a little sigh of relief at his relaxed stance. It made her feel as though he wasn't about to just swing off without a word of goodbye.
I thought that we've established that you are my hero and not the other way around, seeing as you rescued me.
eyes bugging out wide. Mary Jane's throat constricted in an unpleasant way as a coughing fit overcame her. His eye lenses widened in alarm and seemed to be looking for a way to help her. But there was no need, as she managed to get a hold of herself enough to say, "So you do remember me?" A gloved hand came up to rub at the back of his masked head awkwardly. By his mannerisms, he looked sheepish. Which was strange to think about how she was able to read his emotions so well without being able to see his expressions. Spider-Man was just that expressive with his body language, she guessed, and internally she smiled. She liked a man who was willing to show his emotions.
Well, yeah. I mean, how could I not?
He stammered. His hands moved about sporadically in animated motions as he spoke in a nervous jumble of words.
You really did save me that night. With no ulterior motives, might I add. Which is plain remarkable in my book. And, well, you had the chance to unmask me when I was at my most vulnerable. And you didn't. And...
Spider-Man stopped his animated movements as he squared his shoulders and faced her head-on.
And I just want to say thank you.
Mary Jane stared at him in mild surprise. Well, you're welcome, but your thanks is unnecessary. Spider-Man cocked his head to the side, curious, and Mary Jane felt the need to explain further. It's just that you do so much for the city already. What I did is nothing compared to all the good that you've done.
But it meant everything to me.
Spider-Man replied, sincerely. Mary Jane decided to change the subject, for once uncomfortable with the praise. Well, I'm glad to see that you're on the mend, Spider. Mr. Stark's been taking care of you? Spider-Man snorted, less than amused as he shook his head woefully.
Yeah, a little too much, if you ask me.
Mary Jane shot him a curious look, prompting him without words to elaborate further. Spider-Man sighed.
Let's just say that I've sort of been, grounded.
Mary Jane blinked once in surprise. Then an amused noise escaped her throat before she could stop it. Grounded? She asked, unable to keep the laughter from escaping her voice, because it really was a ridiculous notion. Spider-Man, the great and powerful superhero of New York City, was grounded by Iron Man. If only the world knew how much of a softie Tony Stark was when it came to Spider-Man. Then again, it did make sense to Mary Jane. Spider-Man was quite lovable. His moods and personality were just so infectious. All she wanted to do was wrap her arms around him and never let go.
Yeah, I'm technically not supposed to be out right now.
He responded slowly, embarrassed. Mary Jane smirked at him. How she ever thought that he was an adult, she would never know. He was so obviously a teenage boy in his mannerisms alone. Add on with the way that he spoke? Yep, definitely a teenager. My, what a rule breaker you've become. Next, I'll hear all about how Spider-Man robbed a candy store in the Daily Beagle's next issue. Spider-Man laughed, and the sound of it warmed her heart.
More like robbed a GameStop, but to each their own.
So he liked video games.
But it would make Jolly Jonah's day if I did go on a stealing spree.
Spider-Man continued.
So, one could call it a roundabout act of kindness.
Though his comment was amusing, irritation pricked at her subconscious as she was reminded of that loud-mouthed, lying, prejudiced man. I don't like the way that they treat you. The press. Mary Jane said with a sad shake of her head. Her expression filled with empathy as she looked up at him. But Spider-Man surprised her by waving off her concern, seeming completely undeterred by it.
Don't worry about it. I don't do this for the glory.
Mary Jane tilted her head, watching him closely as she studied his masked face. Then, what do you do it for? Spider-Man was quiet for a minute, seeming to be in deep thought. She wondered what was going on through that glorious head of his at the moment. All of the crazy, fantastical things he must have seen. Finally, he answered.
Responsibility.
The breath in her lungs left her. The way that he said that, with so much strength and confidence, that left her feeling even more in awe of him than she had been previously. Because she had just discovered yet another side of him. The part of him that truly made him the hero that he was. His personal drive. There certainly seemed to be layers to Spider-Man. And something told Mary Jane that there was plenty more layers left for her to discover. All she needed was the time to explore them. But as if in an attempt to contradict this very thought.
So,
His voice was hesitant.
I think I should be going.
Spider-Man said suddenly, violently breaking her from her thoughts. What? Mary Jane asked. A deep-seated panic settled in her stomach at the thought of him leaving. Why? What if she never sees him again? What if he forgot all about her after this? No. She needed more time.
Because I'm technically not supposed to be out right now, remember? I have to get back before anyone notices that I'm gone.
Mary Jane swallowed heavily before she took a deliberate step forward. When he didn't move away from her closer proximity, she took the remaining 2 steps forward until her hand was able to come up and rest on his arm. The muscles there rippled beneath her touch. Her knees became a little weak at the thought of how much raw strength there was beneath her fingertips. Her eyes connected to the lenses of his goggles. When can I see you again? Spider-Man froze, hesitating. Mary Jane let out a sigh. Oh, come on, Spider. I think that I've proven that I can be trusted, right? He swallowed visibly. She could see his Adam's apple bob from beneath his mask.
It's not that. It's just...
He broke off with an exaggerated sigh of his own. For he shocked her by suddenly wrapping his arms tight around her waist and bringing her close in his embrace. Butterflies erupted in her stomach. Even with the droplets of cold rain, his touch felt so very warm. It coaxed at the part of her that had ventured out in search of comfort she so desperately needed. And she found herself melting against him, succumbing to the feeling his protective strength provided as she closed her eyes, basking in it.
If we are really fated to meet again,
He said with a soft whisper in her ear.
then fate will help me find you.
Then, just as suddenly, he let go of her and was leaping in the air before he attached himself to the wall and crawled over the edge of the rooftop. Oh my goodness! Is this really the end, or will they be fated to meet again? Let me know in the comments below what you think. And trust me, Peter's going to be kicking himself for that last line because he's such a dork. I would really appreciate it if you all left me a comment down below and also liked and subscribed. It really encourages me to continue on with this story. Thank you so much for all of those who have already subscribed. I appreciate every single one of you out there. Also, many of you have already suspected that I'm an avid comic book reader. Not the new stuff from ASM. We don't talk about the new stuff from ASM. We talk about the old stuff from ASM. Because we enjoy those stories. We don't enjoy the new stuff. Come on. Fuck Paul, by the way. Anyway, as a result, you'll be seeing a ton of random Easter eggs dropped throughout this story. I would love it if you could point them out in the comments down below if you managed to catch them. Thank you so much for listening. And also thank you to everybody who volunteered their voices for this audiobook series. And then also a special thank you to my editor who puts together these hodgepodge of voices. I love this community so much. Everybody is always so kind. And as always, thank you so much for listening, and please ring the bell down below so you know when the next chapter releases. Thank you!